Could your home really be threatened because of the color of your roof? I never thought so until I received a $500 fine from my HOA for something as simple as shingles. What they didn't realize was that their power trip would lead them straight to a courtroom where justice would be served in the most satisfying way possible. Comment below with the wildest HOA rule you've ever seen, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the shocking ending. My name is Robert, and I've lived in the same suburban community for over 30 years. Back when my wife and I first moved here in 1987, this neighborhood was the American dream. Tree-lined streets, block parties every summer, and neighbors who actually knew each other's names. The HOA was just a formality back then, mostly handling the community pool and making sure nobody painted their house neon pink. Last spring, a severe hailstorm damaged my roof. I got 3 estimates, filed the proper paperwork with my insurance, and even sent a courtesy note to the HOA board explaining I'd be replacing my roof. The old shingles were a standard weathered gray, and I selected a new architectural shingle in charcoal blend, a dark gray with subtle variations that looked nearly identical to the original, just newer. 2 weeks after the roof was completed, I found an official-looking letter in my mailbox. It wasn't a welcome to the new roof season. It was a violation notice from the HOA, fining me $500 for unapproved roof color. I shook my head thinking it must be a mistake. I'd lived here for decades, never had a single violation, and had followed all the proper procedures. I called the HOA office and spoke with Brenda, the administrative assistant who'd been there since the neighborhood was founded. "Robert, I'm so sorry about this," she said in a hushed tone. "The new board president, Mrs. Henderson, has been really strict about the covenants lately. She's the one who spotted your roof during her neighborhood inspection yesterday." I sighed. Mrs. Henderson had moved in 3 years ago and immediately positioned herself as the neighborhood watchdog. She'd made several enemies already by reporting residents for minor infractions like leaving their garbage bins out an hour too long or having non-approved seasonal decorations. "I don't understand," I told Brenda. "The color is practically identical to what was there before, and I sent a notice about the replacement. The board is claiming that the exact shade wasn't submitted in writing for approval before installation," Brenda explained. "According to the covenants, all exterior modifications require pre-approval, including color samples." This seemed ridiculous. Who gets a roof replaced and submits color samples? But I figured it was just a misunderstanding. I wrote a polite letter to the board, explaining that the color matched the neighborhood aesthetic and was essentially the same as my previous roof. A week later, I received another letter. This one informed me that my fine had increased to $750, and if I didn't pay within 10 days, they would place a lien on my property. Now I was getting angry. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address this in person. I arrived early, taking a seat in the community center where we'd held countless neighborhood potlucks over the years. The meeting began with routine business, then moved to violation reports. When my name was called, I stood up to explain my situation. Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman in her late 50s with perfectly coiffed hair, interrupted me before I could finish my first sentence. "Mr. Peterson, the rules are clear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "All exterior modifications require pre-approval. You failed to follow procedure, and now you're facing the consequences." "But the color is virtually identical to what was there before," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not like I installed bright purple shingles." Several neighbors nodded in agreement. My next-door neighbor, Tom, who had lived across from me since we both moved in, stood up. "I've seen Robert's roof," Tom said. "It looks fine. It matches the neighborhood perfectly. This seems like an overreaction." Mrs. Henderson's face tightened. "The board has spoken. The fine stands, and it will increase by $250 each week until it's paid or the roof is replaced with an approved color." The room fell silent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were going to fine me hundreds of dollars per week for a roof that looked completely normal. Over the next month, the fines mounted to 20. I received threatening letters almost daily. "Mrs. Henderson herself started driving by my house, slowing down to inspect my roof with binoculars. It was harassment, plain and simple. I tried to reason with other board members, but they either supported Mrs. Henderson or were too intimidated by her to speak up. The neighborhood atmosphere had changed. People were whispering about me, avoiding eye contact when I walked by. The community I'd loved for decades was turning toxic. If you think this HOA is out of control now, just wait for the twist coming up. Subscribe so you never miss another instant karma story. One afternoon, as I was researching my options online, I came across a state homeowners association forum. Someone had posted about a similar situation with their HOA, and in the comments, a lawyer mentioned a recent court case in our state that limited HOA power over aesthetic choices. The case, Johnson v. Willow Creek HOA, had established that HOAs couldn't enforce arbitrary aesthetic standards that weren't clearly defined in their governing documents. More importantly, the court ruled that HOAs must follow their own procedures precisely when enforcing violations. I dug out my HOA's covenants and bylaws, which I hadn't looked at in years. As I read through them, I noticed something interesting. While the covenants did require pre-approval for exterior modifications, they didn't specify exactly what colors were approved or prohibited for roofs. The only mention was that colors should be harmonious with the neighborhood character. My charcoal blend certainly met that vague standard. But more importantly, I found a section detailing the violation process. According to the bylaws, the board was required to send a courtesy notice before issuing any fines, giving the homeowner 30 days to correct the issue. They had skipped this step entirely, going straight to a $500 fine. I also discovered that Mrs. Henderson had been elected as board president just 6 months ago, and she had pushed through several amendments to the bylaws without proper notice to homeowners or a vote at a regular meeting, both violations of the HOA's own rules and state law. Armed with this information, I contacted a local homeowners' rights organization. They connected me with a lawyer who agreed to take my case pro bono as he was building a challenge against HOA overreach in our state. We sent a detailed letter to the HOA board, outlining their procedural violations and the legal precedent from the Johnson case. We demanded that they drop all fines and cease their harassment, or we would take them to court. Their response was swift and arrogant. They not only refused to drop the fines, but increased them to 3-0 and initiated lien proceedings against my property. That's when we filed our lawsuit. The court date was set for 3 months later. During that time, the harassment intensified. Mrs. Henderson organized neighborhood watch groups that would drive by my house multiple times a day. She sent out a newsletter warning residents about the dangers of noncompliance and hinting that my property values were affecting everyone in the neighborhood. But something unexpected happened. As word spread about my lawsuit, other residents started coming forward with their own stories of HOA abuse. Tom from next door had been fined for planting unapproved flowers. A young couple down the street had been threatened with legal action over their fence color. An elderly widow on a fixed income had been fined because her lawn wasn't green enough during a drought. By the time we reached court, we had a dozen residents willing to testify about the HOA's pattern of harassment and arbitrary enforcement. The courtroom was packed with neighbors on the day of the hearing. Mrs. Henderson and the board members sat on one side, looking confident in their expensive suits. My lawyer and I sat on the other, surrounded by supporters from the neighborhood. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, listened patiently as both sides presented their cases. The HOA's lawyer argued that I had willfully violated the covenants by failing to get pre-approval for my roof color and that the fines were justified. When it was our turn, my lawyer systematically dismantled their argument. He presented evidence of their procedural violations, the lack of a courtesy notice, the improper amendment of bylaws, and the vague nature of the color restrictions themselves. Then he called witnesses. Tom testified about the normal appearance of my roof. Other residents shared their experiences with HOA harassment. Finally, an expert witness testified about the Johnson case and how it directly applied to our situation. The HOA's lawyer tried to counter, but he was clearly flustered. When Mrs. Henderson took the stand, she came across as rigid and unreasonable, admitting under cross-examination that she had personally driven by my house at least 20 times to document the violation. The turning point came when my lawyer presented evidence that Mrs. Henderson's own house had several violations of the covenants, unapproved shutters, a non-compliant mailbox, and landscape lighting that hadn't been approved by the board. She had exempted herself from the very rules she was enforcing against others. After hearing all the evidence, the judge didn't take long to make her decision. This court finds that the HOA has failed to follow its own procedures in enforcing its covenants, she stated firmly. The fines against Mr. Peterson are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to pay Mr. Peterson's legal fees in the amount of $15,000. A gasp went through the courtroom. Mrs. Henderson's face turned pale. The judge wasn't finished. The court also finds that the current board has violated state law in its amendment of bylaws without proper notice or vote. All amendments passed in the last year are hereby invalidated. Finally, the court orders the HOA to revise its covenants to provide clear, specific guidelines for exterior modifications, with reasonable procedures for approval. She looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. And Mrs. Henderson, you are personally liable for $2,000 in damages for harassment, as your conduct went well beyond what is acceptable for an HOA board member. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of approval. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Justice had been served. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed dramatically. Mrs. Henderson resigned from the board, and several other members stepped down as well. New leadership was elected, including Tom, who had become a vocal advocate for homeowners' rights. The new board worked with residents to revise the covenants, making them more reasonable and transparent. They even held a town hall meeting to apologize for the previous board's actions and to hear residents' concerns. My roof, by the way, remains the same charcoal blend color. It looks great, and several neighbors have since used the same color on their own roofs without any issues. Looking back, this fight wasn't just about a roof color or even the money. It was about standing up to bullies who abused their power. It was about protecting the rights of homeowners to enjoy their property without unreasonable interference. And it was about restoring the sense of community that had made this neighborhood such a wonderful place to live for over 30 years. If you're dealing with an overreaching HOA, know that you have rights. Document everything, follow procedures carefully, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Sometimes, the system does work, and justice can prevail. Comment below with the most ridiculous HOA rule you've ever encountered, and let me know if you've ever had to fight back against an unfair decision. And if you enjoyed this story of instant karma, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video about another HOA that got exactly what was coming to them.